Okay, hello everybody. My name is Tom. I'm an educator here at Cheehaw Park and Zoo, and today we are going to be talking about another one of our classification categories. So today we are going to be talking about birds. So first, we are going to talk about common characteristics of birds, things that we can use to identify a bird and what makes a bird a bird. We are going to talk about some really cool traits that they have to help them out with some of those characteristics. And then we are going to look at different birds and see some other unique adaptations or traits that these different birds have to help them out with completing their annual life histories and some of the different things that birds commonly do. So it'd be really cool to make some distinctions between different birds and look at some really cool characteristics and traits. Okay, so first I figured we could start by talking about what makes a bird a bird. And so a couple of characteristics that I think about when thinking about birds is first that they are endotherms, which means similar to mammals like us, they have to produce their own body heat. So they can maintain a higher and stable body temperature because they are producing their own body temperature, but that also means it requires energy, right? They need to be able to maintain those body temperatures. They're not like animals like reptiles and amphibians that can rely on the environment to keep them warm. They do have to burn energy and use energy to make that body heat. So they are endotherms. Another common characteristic of birds is that they lay amniotic eggs, which is important for a couple of reasons. So the first is that these eggs are hard-shelled. They do lay hard-shelled eggs for the most part. And those are nice because they provide protection for chicks and embryos as they begin developing. Another thing that is important is that they are also somewhat porous though, which means that oxygen can move in and out, air can move in and out so that there is air for the developing young, but also they can retain moisture. So that's really important because birds oftentimes lay their eggs in things like nests, or possibly even on the ground. A lot of birds will lay their eggs right on the ground in nests that may be formed on the ground. But either way, it's important that they can retain moisture because they are not eggs that are found in the water. Again, other animals like amphibians will lay their eggs in the water, right? So they don't have to worry about moisture or remaining hydrated. But when birds lay their eggs in nests or on the ground, they do have to worry about that. So these eggs are nice in that they help retain moisture. So the developing young will always have water available. And then lastly, amniotic eggs, they have yolk. So what's nice is that they have a food source too, a really nutritious food source that will help the embryo and the young chick in the egg develop until a point where they are ready to hatch out. And so one thing that's cool about birds too is that little chicks have a specialized little notch on the end of their beak called a little egg tooth that they can use to crack open the egg when they are ready to hatch out, which is pretty cool. Another thing that is common in birds is what's called a cloaca. So we'll talk a little bit too about why the cloaca is really important for flight. But essentially, it's one opening for reproductive purposes and also excreting waste. So that's common as well. And then when we really think about birds, what do we think about? We think about wings, feathers, and flight. So now flight is not common to all birds, but wings and feathers are. So we know there are lots of different types of feathers and they serve different roles. So I figured we could talk about some of the different roles that feathers play, which is really cool. So the first I wanted to talk about is although they are endotherms and they can produce their own body heat, that also means that they want to stay warm, right? Just like all animals, they can be found in colder conditions, and so staying warm is important. And so anything that can help them do that will prevent them from burning more energy when they need to. And so the first kind of feather I want to talk about is called a down feather. Let's see. It's kind of hard to see with the light in here. But hopefully what you can see is it is pretty fluffy. And so these types of feathers are what are really important for birds for staying warm. you're not going to see these feathers too often because they're going to be found underneath their wings. These are the type of feathers that are going to be found closer to the body. They are good for holding air or having spaces for air that will keep the bird warm and kind of create a barrier. So really they're trying to insulate themselves or have a layer of air trapped in their feathers next to their body that'll separate them from other air that may be colder. So these down feathers are really nice, they're really soft, and they're a way for birds to keep themselves warm. So that's just one function that feathers can do. Another is that they can be used for attracting mates. So we are going to talk about, when we think about that, we think about a peacock, right? So males have these really showy feathers that you can see that have some really cool color patterns. And this is because males want their genes to be passed on in the population. And so they try to be as attractive to females as they can with these really showy feathers. And so that's another big role that feathers can play. So other birds have really colorful feathers. This is something that's found on a macaw. So that's pretty common too, is for birds to have ways to attract mates for breeding purposes. And so these are two examples of feathers that can do that. Another really cool function that can be found on feathers is a lot of birds that are found in the water will actually coat their feathers in a waxy material that allows them to kind of shear water off. Just like a raincoat will, it'll have water just run right off of it so that they don't get soaked and retain a lot of the moisture. So a lot of times, this is a duck wing, a lot of times ducks will cover themselves in kind of a waxy coating that they produce, and they will cover and they will rub it against their feathers. And so I'm not going to demonstrate it right now, but if I were to dump water on this, it would just run right off, which is really cool because then they don't have to worry about that. Could also help keep them warm. If they're not wet, they're not going to be as cold, right? If you think about jumping in a pool after you get out, if it's windy or cold out, you're going to be even more cold once you're wet. So that's really nice. And that can also keep birds lighter as well. Because if you're not carrying around all the weight of water, then you're going to be lighter, which is nice for flight. So that's another really cool thing that feathers and wings can do. And then when we think about feathers, we most often think about flight, right? So feathers, you can have things like down feathers that are found on the body, but there are also feathers on the wings. So when we think about flight, we think about how birds are able to fly. So what they do is they use their wings to push air back. So they have what are called primary and secondary feathers. So if we look at this wing, our primary feathers are found near the tip of the wing or the end of the wing, whereas our secondary feathers are found closer to the body. So the body would be here, right? And so two things that are really important for flight are thrust and lift. So they need thrust to propel themselves forward and get in motion, but they also need lift to get up into the air, right? So these wings on the end, these primary wings are really important for thrust, and then their secondary wings closer to the body. You can see this feather actually ends right here. So our secondary feathers close to the body are going to be really important for lifting them. Now, one thing that I want you to notice, which is really cool about wings, which is really important for flight, is that they're not just flat. You can kind of see they have a curve to them. And that's really important as well because wings themselves also help with lift. And so one way that they do this is because when they're in the air, maybe if we look at it this way, you can really see that curve. And so there's more surface area on the top of wings than there is on the bottom, which is more of just a straight shot. And that's really important because differences in air pressure can actually help with lift. So when air particles coming at the wing move over a greater surface area on the top, those air particles spread out and there's less air pressure. Whereas when air comes and goes underneath, there's less surface area, so the air particles are closer together and there's more pressure. And that difference in pressure, the less air pressure on top and more pressure on the bottom actually creates lift and pushes the bird up. So having wings with this, this curved shape is really important and really cool. It's a really cool adaptation for birds to have lift and be able to move through the air. Now they also need to flap, right, to create that thrust and be able to move forward initially. But once they're in the air, that difference in pressure can be really useful for them to maintain flight and use less energy during flight. Now, wings are super important for flight, and they are useful and they work. We see birds flying all the time, but birds want to make flight as easy on themselves as possible, right? So they have a number of other characteristics and things that help out with flight. So really, when you think about birds, they want to be as light as possible. They do not want to be heavy. The heavier they are, the more weight they have to support during flight. And so another thing, two things that can slow birds down. So we talked about thrust forward and lift up, but there will also be pull and drag. So there's going to be weight pulling them down, and then any features that kind of catch air is going to create drag, which is going to slow them down. So both that drag from behind and the pull pulling them back down are both going to make flight more difficult for birds. So they want to reduce pull by reducing their weight. And so other things that help with reducing weight are that birds have special bones that are filled with sacs of air. And so rather than having solid bones that are going to weigh a lot more, they have bones that are lightweight because they're filled with air in some places. Now, not all the bones throughout the body are filled with air, but a lot of them are. And so that really helps reduce their overall weight. They don't have a bladder, a urinary bladder, which also reduces their weight a lot. So earlier I was talking about how the cloaca is going to be really important for flight. So and because they don't have a urinary bladder to collect all of that, urine that they would have to dispel, they actually are they've kind of adapted to pull the water back into the bloodstream that's in their waist. So it doesn't need to collect in a urinary bladder because they don't have one. So by having that water just getting pulled back into the bloodstream, they don't have to worry about collecting it and having it weigh them down. So that also really helps reduce weight, which is really nice for birds that are going to rely on flying a lot. Okay, and then what I also want to show you, which is really helpful for flight, is, and something else that's common to birds is the skeleton. So what I have here is the skeleton of a pigeon. Oh, so it's going to be difficult to see. Okay, so have you ever been, let's say at Thanksgiving, and you have the turkey, and you and someone else pull on the wishbone? Do you guys know what the wishbone is? And whoever gets it to break so that they get the bigger part, they have good luck and they can make a wish, right? So that actually is found in birds, and so you can see that right here. I wish we could see it a little bit better. Okay, so that's right there. So what the wishbone is it's actually their two clavicles, which is the bone that connects their chest plate or their sternum to their shoulders. But in birds, their two clavicles are actually fused together. And that's really important. Let's see if we can see it this way. You can see it a little bit there. That's really important for providing stability and flexibility. So it's flexible, but it also provides stability for the shoulders. And if you think about it, birds that are relying on their wings that are connected to their shoulders are going to have a lot of pressure applied to their shoulders. They really need to rely on them for flight. So there's going to be a lot of pressure. So having that fused bone is going to be really useful for them during flight. And then what I also want you to notice is that birds have this really big at the bottom here, keeled chest plate or sternum. And so that's really important. That's this part down here. That keeled chest plate or sternum, that's really big. And sometimes even the wishbone will be fused to that for even more support. That's really important for birds because a lot of what we call breast muscle is going to be attached to their chest. And that's super important because that breast muscle is going to run up to the shoulders again. And that is what is really needed for them to be able to flap their wings and fly. All of that muscle is needed to support the motion in their wings. There's also muscle in the wings that will help with flight. But that enlarged sternum or chest is really important for attachment of muscles, lots of built up muscle that's going to be needed for flight. So that's super important for birds. Okay, so not only is reducing weight and adding that extra muscle important for flight and helpful for flight, but there are other ways that they can help with flight as well. So not only did I talk about reducing pull by reducing weight, but I also talked about drag, which is anything that can kind of keep them, you know, having air pulling against them or kind of not making them as efficient at moving through the air. So a couple of things that helps with reducing drag is their beak. So if you think about it, their beak is narrow and air is going to move right past it, and their head is kind of streamlined. So not only does their beak just have air move past it, but it's also streamlined. And most birds, when you see a bird flying, you don't see them flying, you know, with a lot of air or feathers puffed out. They kind of have a streamlined body too, right? So that streamlined body and smooth feathers on their body that all run downward are all going to reduce drag as well and make flying a little bit easier. And then the last thing that I forgot to mention too is that birds have this beak instead of teeth. So they don't have teeth, which is also going to help them be lighter. So not having those additional things in their mouth is going to without having teeth, they're going to be a little bit lighter as well. So that's also going to help with weight. Okay. So lots of cool characteristics that help reduce weight and pull and make them more efficient at flying and streamlined to reduce drag, as well as that specialized big sternum and chest muscle. So really cool, lots of things to help them out. And so those are things like the flight feathers. Okay, so kind of got off on a tangent about wings and feathers, but we know that's a really important part about birds. And now I'm going to share my screen with you because let's look at some differences in birds. So we've talked about our common characteristics, things like them being warm-blooded, endotherms, or making their own body heat, having eggs that can be laid on land that have food and water available to them, and protection through the hard shell. We've talked about all birds have feathers and wings, and feathers play lots of different roles. But now let's look at different birds and some cool characteristics that are unique to those different birds, or how they have specialized characteristics within some of these common characteristics that help them in their habitat. So I'm going to share my screen. And so what you can see here right off the bat is that peacock that I was showing you earlier with the really pretty feathers. So you can see that they're actually attached to the peacock. So what you can see is they are going to try to be attractive for the females. They want to try to have the females pick them so that their genes will get into the population. So they try to be as showy as possible. So that's really cool to see. But let's talk about some differences that can be seen in birds now. So birds all have beaks. I just talked about that being nice for flight. What you can see is they all are pretty streamlined and will help air move past them relatively easily. But you will also notice there's some very distinct beaks here on this page. And so we have a perching bird, some kind of perching bird on the left. And what you can see is they have kind of a really short and wide beak, kind of looks muscular or tough. What we have here is a duck with kind of a flat beak, and that's a little bit wider. And then we have something like an ibis here, or a water bird, some kind of water bird or wading bird, what we'll say. And they have really long and narrow beaks. And so when we think about why these beaks are so different, one of the big reasons is because they have different food that they are searching for. And so having different beaks will help them be more efficient at catching or eating their food. So the first beak we were talking about, this perching bird, they are going to eat things like seeds or vegetation. So when they find a seed or something, they want to be able to crack it so that they can eat it. So having a really short and strong beak is going to help them be really good at cracking seeds and eating them. Then we have our duck here. So our duck can be eating things like vegetation in the water, and so they just want to be able to scoop things up really easily and eat it. And even if they're eating other things in the water, such as insects, having that wider bill in the water is going to be really good at scooping and catching things. And then a lot of wading birds, such as this ibis over here, that have long, narrow beaks. That's going to be really useful for them to stick their beak into the ground or into the water to catch things like insects. So they are being much more precise with their pecks, right? Because they want to catch certain things right away. And so they want to be able to get further into the water and further into the ground, and they want to be really precise so they can have a narrow beak to pick things up really easily. Especially if it's in the water, right? If they have a long beak, then they don't have to stick their face into the water as much. They might just have to stick their beak in, which is really nice. So, it's common. Beaks are common in birds, but there's definitely variation and specializations in beaks out there that make them really good at eating their different food sources. And there are other beaks as well. So we are going to look at a special animal in a little bit, and he has another variation of a beak that I'm going to hopefully show you that will help understand what kind of food they eat. So far we've talked about things like insects, maybe vegetation or other invertebrates in the water, or seeds and that kind of vegetation, some harder vegetation. But then we're going to talk about one other kind of thing that birds will eat, and another kind of beak that will be important for that. Okay, there's also feet. So we have bird beaks and feet. So again, here there are some pretty distinct things you can see, some variation in the feet of different birds. Let me uncover this bird up here. And so right off the bat, up at the top, we see our duck again, or some of our water birds, and they have webbed feet. So that is definitely one thing that jumps out to us, and that's going to be really useful for birds that are found in the water commonly, and that are going to be doing some swimming or even remaining on the surface and swimming while they're on the surface of the water. So having that webbing in between the feet is going to help propel them through the water, so that's really important. Then on the left, we have this parakeet here, the green bird, and you can see a couple things going on with his feet. So the first is that he is gripped onto a branch, so it definitely helps with stabilization up in branches and things like that. But he's also using his other foot kind of as like a hand, right? He's gripping onto food, and you can see he brought some of that food up to his mouth. So some animals, like parakeets, might actually use their feet like hands to maneuver, to grab different things, and to bring it to their mouth. So we have a couple birds here at Chihuahua Park and Zoo that once we give them apple slices, they'll take it right with their foot and bring it to their mouth, just like we would a fork to our mouth to eat. So that's really cool. That's another use of feet. Up on the top right, again, we can see a bird, like a perching bird, something like a warbler or something like that. And so we call them a perching bird because they have feet that are really good for allowing them, kind of like the parakeet, to grip onto different surfaces. So it looks like this bird here is on a telephone wire or something like that. But what you can see is that they have one toe that goes to the back and the other three on the front, and they are really good at flying and landing really easily onto different surfaces and perching on them. And then lastly, what you see is some eagle feet right there. And so what you're going to notice with them, although all these birds actually do look like they have some pretty sharp nails on the ends of their feet as well, you can see he has some really big talons, is what we call them. And those are going to be really useful for scooping up food like fish and carrying that food to somewhere safe where they can eat them. and they can be really sharp. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later with our other bird that I have for us. Stop sharing really quick. So what you can see is some of these nails on talons can be very sharp. You can imagine if these four toes on the talon come in, they are going to be able to grip onto something and probably not let go. That's going to be really effective at holding on to different sources. So again, things like eagles can just scoop down, catch whatever prey they're going for, whether that be a thing like a rodent in a field or fish in the water. They're going to be able to hold on to it really well and bring that back to somewhere where they can eat it comfortably. So really cool. Okay, I'll share my screen again. So I just wanted you to be able to see some variation in beaks and feet. So something that all birds have, but definitely something that can differ as well, depending on what, again, their habitat is like, what kind of food they're going for, and things like that. Okay, so this is kind of a cool bird. So we've been talking a lot about flight and feathers that are important for flight. But what you'll see here, and what I want you to kind of notice and look at, is the feet on this bird. So looking down at the feet, is there any ideas as to what kind of habitat this bird will be found in? And the picture also gives it away a little bit too. This is more of a water bird. So this is called a double-crested cormorant. They are found in the United States, and this bird is really good at being in the water. So they have kind of an interesting looking beak as well, a little bit different than anything else we saw, and they eat fish. So not only are they found in the water, but they are really good at diving down into the water. And so a number of things that we have talked about in our birds is going to be different in this bird. So the first is we've talked about birds wanting to reduce weight so that they can be really good at flight. This bird has kind of switched it up a little bit and has tried to actually increase its weight, because when it is diving down in water looking for fish, especially out in things like lakes or the ocean, they want to be able to go down into the water. So weight is actually going to help them propel themselves dive down into the water deeper and faster. So they have solid bones, not those bones filled with air sacs, because they want their bones to be really dense and heavy so that they can get further down into the water. And then we also talked about birds applying a waxy coating to their feathers that will allow them to, just have that water run off them, and they won't have the weight of the water packed into all their feathers either. They do absorb water, and that weight of the water will also help them get down deeper. And so between those different couple of things, they are very effective at diving down. They can go up to 20 to 30 feet down into the water to catch fish. You can also see they have a pretty, really pretty aqua blue eye. So they have good eyesight as well, so that when they're in the water and they locate a fish, they can home in on it pretty well to catch it. And then what's kind of cool too is that when looking at this bird, you can see that he looks like he has normal feathers for flight, but why he's actually holding those wings outward is because he is sunning himself. So because they do pull water into their feathers and it doesn't just go off them like other birds, he's sunning himself to dry himself out, because he does have a lot of moisture retained in his feathers. So that's why you will see, if you ever see double-crested cormorants, you'll see a lot of them just out on rocks like this one with their wings out, and it's just because they're sunning themselves and warming up and drying off, which is kind of funny looking. Okay, so now we have ostriches. So ostriches are native to Africa. They're found in savanna or desert-like habitat, so drier areas for sure. One thing that's nice about these birds is that they are pretty good at retaining moisture, so they will not be, they won't get too sick or unhealthy if they don't have water for a little while. They are good at retaining moisture. And also when they are eating, they are also pulling in water. So when they're feeding, they are getting water that way. If they come across water, they will drink it, but they are able to get enough water from the food they eat to maintain themselves. Now, again, we were talking about how that cormorant switched things up a little bit and isn't too similar to a lot of other birds. This ostrich is also not too similar to a lot of other birds in that, again, we are talking a lot about flight and feathers and wings and how they're useful for flight, but this bird does not fly, right? So the ostrich doesn't fly, but you can still see they have wings. So what's the point of having wings if they don't fly? That's because they will stick their, similar to the cormorant sticking their wings out, ostriches will stick their wings out as a way to look mighty and to look tough. And so they are trying to be impressive to females for mating purposes. So they'll stick their wings out, try to make themselves look really big, and try to look tough. And that is hopefully going to attract females. So that's primarily why they use their wings. But if they don't fly, what do? So you can see these really big legs on these ostriches. They are strong, they are long, and they can get ostriches moving pretty fast. So they can get up to about 40 miles per hour in a sprint, which if you think about that, that's pretty fast. When we're going 40 miles an hour in our cars, that's pretty fast, right? These birds can actually sprint up to 40 miles an hour, and they can maintain just normal speeds when moving of around 30 miles an hour, which is still really fast, especially for a bird that has all these feathers, right? So going back to drag, they are going to have a little bit of drag. They're not, the most streamlined in terms of birds, but those legs will really help them move fast. And something else that's pretty unique to ostriches is they're the only bird that have two toes. And so those two toes are going to help them kick off the ground and be able to move a lot faster as well, as opposed to having more toes that's going to create more traction, right? Or no, having more toes is going to, increase surface area. So when they only have two, they can kick off the ground a lot faster, and that helps them move faster on land, which is pretty cool. And then one other thing here I have that I want to show you all while we're talking about the ostriches is I actually have here an egg. So this is the largest egg that we know that is laid now. It can be up to 3 pounds, which if you think about a normal chicken egg, it's about the equivalent of 24 of those. So they're very large, and they weigh a decent amount, up to 3 pounds or over. But it's still a hard-shelled egg like others, so can still have the same features, right? They're laid in land, especially since they're found in savanna or desert-like habitat. Having an egg that is going to provide protection from things like loss of water is really important. But it's also cool to share because it's the largest egg these days that is laid, which is pretty special. So lots of cool things that ostriches do. The two toes, the largest egg, they're found in that really dry environment, but cool birds. And different from other birds that we've talked about, right? Because they don't fly, and yet they still have those feathers and wings. All right. And then one more I wanted to talk about. So we just talked about a bird that's in a rather dry and hot environment. So I figured we'd go to the other end of the spectrum and talk about a bird that we've all heard of that's found in a cold environment. So this is the emperor penguin. This is a bird that is found in Antarctica and needs to have some special features to allow them to maintain themselves in really cold environments. So the emperor penguins, what I want you to notice here is that there's a lot packed together in this picture. And so one thing they do to help themselves out in really cold environments is a little bit more of a behavioral trait or pattern that they have, and that is that they do something called huddling. So there can be up to 5,000 to 10,000 penguins huddling together when it gets really cold, especially when conditions get really harsh. And what that's doing is they are all packing together to have as much body heat packed together into a small space as possible. But not only is that super important, but they also have an even cooler behavior, where they actually have a rotating system in place where birds will take turns being on the outside so that not one bird is always found on the outer space where the wind is going to be really strong. It's going to be the coldest. They will rotate individuals out the whole time to make sure everybody is sharing the harsh conditions on the outside and where it's really cold. And then once they get really cold, they can start rotating inwards where they'll warm up more. And then what's most important is that all the young and the baby penguins are going to be found in the center of these large huddles. And that's because they are not going to have as well developed of feathers yet, and they're going to have smaller bodies, so they're going to be able to cool down faster. So having them in the middle is really important and really helps protect them in Antarctica where it can get very cold. Now, that's a bit of a behavioral thing, but they are also have some other characteristics that help them with staying warm. So earlier we were talking about down feathers, keeping them warm. Penguins have multiple layers of feathers that really help them out. So the first is kind of like the cormorant that we were talking about, that water bird. Penguins will do their feeding in the water, and so they may even go into the cracks of ice to catch food for feeding. So they are very good at diving. Unlike the cormorant that'll go to, like 30 feet down into the water, penguins can go very, very deep. And so they have feathers that are watertight. They will not let water in, which will help keep the body warm if they don't have that cold water right against their body and their skin. And also when they get out of the water, because it's watertight, it's not going to be retained. So they're not going to be super cold when they get out of the water, which is really nice. So, and then they can dive super deep and they can stay underwater for a really long time too. Which is nice because they need to be able to hunt, especially when I talk about one of the other behavioral things they do, which is they will actually carry their eggs around on their feet because they don't even want their eggs to be exposed when it's super cold either. So they will incubate their eggs on the move with them. So they'll carry their eggs on their feet. They won't even let them touch the ground. And then they'll sit on them to help keep them warm and incubate them until the chick is ready to hatch. But during this process, they don't even have time to go out and feed. So when the males are carrying the egg around, they don't even have time to go out and feed. So they will just not feed for up to a month at a time. And so once they are done taking care of the egg and the chick is hatched, they need to go out and get food and eat for a long period of time as well. So they have that long time period of not eating, and then they need to go eat for a while. So being really good at diving and being able to stay underwater for a long time is really effective for being able to catch up on getting food and energy into their bodies, because they can actually lose a lot of weight during that non-feeding period. Especially if you think about it, they have to keep themselves really warm, so they're going to be burning energy. But one thing that's cool that also helps them be in these really cold environments is that they can slow down their metabolism quite a bit so that they are not burning as much energy during that period when they need to stay really warm. So really cool animals, kind of similar. So I was talking about, so not only are their feathers watertight, they also help keep wind out because they're really overlapping and tightly packed feathers. But then they also have really cool feathers that are underneath those watertight feathers. So they have another layer of really special down feathers. So we're talking about the feathers that are closer to the body to help trap air and keep birds warm. They have tiny and very many pockets within their interweaved feathers that create lots of little pockets that can hold air and create a really important insulating layer for the bird. So when I say insulating, I mean the more spaces that they have that can capture air that's closer to the body that'll stay warm, the more of a barrier they kind of have against cold air that's found out in the environment. So that's super important for them as well. So that is, I believe, everything I had for you. So I wanted to show you those couple examples of birds to show you different characteristics and traits that they have, especially in those very different environments. So we talked a lot about flight in the beginning, but then I figured I'd talk about a bird that's found more in the water, like that cormorant, and then really dry and hot and cold environments. So let me check really quick. See if we have any questions. We do not. Okay, so I hope you all learned something really cool topic. I thought it was really interesting to see all the differences between the birds and learn about features that help them be really effective in their environments. I hope you all enjoyed this and learned something, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Take care, everybody.